Okay, David, you with me?
I'm with you.
All right, welcome to a new edition of the Squeaky Chair interviews. My name is Chris, although you're free to call me Mad Cat if you dare. And today I am joined with David Lee Summers. Now, like all authors, he has a full-time job being an astronomer, so that's his day job, but at night he's a novelist. Or if he's an astronomer, maybe he does that at night and writing during. Oh well. So, anyways, he has 8 novels released in both hardback and also in ebook format. This ranges from steampunk to paranormal horror romance, as well as good old science fiction. Now, I initially met David at Phoenix Comic Con. I don't actually remember him very well, but I remember his book cover very well. I think the one with the wolf on it. And I remember seeing
Oh,
that
yes.
book cover, so that's how I remember meeting him. And I'm sorry that I don't remember you beyond that, but um, we have actually sent a lot of emails back and forth with each other in light of my Kickstarter campaign. And I think my camera just turned off. That's fun.
Well, let's see. I'm still seeing you, so
Oh, okay, there we go.
there we go.
So,
Okay.
in my Kickstarter campaign, I reached out to a lot of writers to ask them for their support. And David, more than just posting on Twitter, which is mostly what I asked him to do, said, "Hey, let's do an interview." So I'm like, "Okay, no complaint here." So let me turn it over to you, David. How are you doing today?
I'm doing pretty well. Thank you very much for having me, Chris. A lot of fun to be here on a Sunday afternoon and Labor Day weekend, and great place to hang out.
All right. So why don't you tell us a bit about yourself that I didn't cover?
Well, I think you covered a lot of it. In addition to, I got my degree in astrophysics, and during that time, I continued to write and really have been a fan of writing for a long time, even since my high school days and even long before that. Um, in grad school, I met Kumi Wise, and we got married, and we've been married ever since. We have 2 kids, and so I do that as well as the astronomy as well as the writing. I also like to go on hikes, and I like to cook. So it all keeps me pretty busy.
Okay, so just to let you know, I believe we have one viewer on right now, but something's going on with the Q&A part. It's not working right now, so we will not have that feature during this. I apologize to all of the viewers ahead of time, and to you, David. So tell us about being an astronomer.
Well, my specific job at Kip Peak is that I'm an observing associate. And what that means is that Kip Peak National Observatory is one of the national observatories. And what that means is that astronomers from around the country and from around the world apply for time at Kip Peak, and they are granted time based on the merit of their proposal. So they'll come to Kip Peak, or increasingly, they'll actually work with me, kind of like we're chatting right now, although it'd be over Skype, and they're operating computers at their home institutions. And my job is to be the person who's at the telescope helping them to get the best science they possibly can out of the telescopes. So my job is to know the telescopes, to know the instruments, to help them get what they're after. And what that can be anything from we've used the Kip Peak telescopes to look at planets discovered by the Kepler space probe, NASA's Kepler probe, to verify whether planets really are there or whether these are binary star systems. We often will point our telescopes at supernova remnants to essentially do what I call stellar CSI, post-mortem on these stars. We look at at a large-scale structure of the universe. The Kitt-Peak 4-meter is the telescope that, with Vera Rubin observing, was the telescope that discovered dark matter. Back in my early days at Kitt Peak in the 90s, we were doing supernova observations for a team at Lawrence Livermore that ultimately led to the discovery of dark energy. So it's everything from planets and material in our solar system all the way out to the largest structure stuff in the universe. And I guess I kind of see my specific job as a little like to astronomy what an editor is to a writer, in that as an editor, it's not my job to shine. It's my job to make the author really look as good as they can on the printed page. As an observing associate, it's my job to make sure that the science that the scientist has proposed gets done as they expect to do it.
So it also sounds like you're a little bit of a technician as well for that. You have to show them where the on button is.
Sometimes I have to plug in the power. Sometimes I have to go and pound on something out on the telescope. So it kind of encompasses the whole thing.
Wait, I was
Uh,
just joking about that.
I've and even when it's been my science, I've had to do that. Astronomy is still one of those fields where sometimes you're out at the telescope all by yourself, and if you want to get your science, you're going to have to get the telescope to work.
All right, so you being an astronomer, is that a proper title or is there an astrophysicist?
Well, in this case, my actual title is observing associate.
Yes, but astronomer sounds sexier.
Yeah, it does. It does. It does.
As an observing associate and assistant and being a family man, how do you find time to write?
Well, it's easier now that my kids are older than it was when, say, 18 years ago when I was a new dad. Um, these days, pretty much, actually, the particular way my job schedule is allows me actually quite a bit of time to write, because I work the schedule that's essentially 1 week on, where I work 80 hours in that 1 week, and then I get a week off. And it's during that week off that I do a lot of my writing. And so, I do that when the kids are at school, just kind of almost like I go to a regular day job as a writer during those weeks off. When I was um, when I was a new dad, it was a lot more juggling the times. I did a lot of, okay, we got the baby to bed, and I spent 2 hours at that point just sitting down hammering at the keyboard before I literally fell asleep exhausted, and might wake up in the middle of the night with an idea, and would sit down and write it and get back up again. These days it's actually a lot more sane than it was back in those earlier days, and looking back on it, I'm still not quite sure how I had the energy to do that.
Now, I do have a question about your job and about looking at things through a telescope that I've always wondered about. Because we see these images on NASA's website, pictures of space and all of that. And I'm wondering, has the photos been, and this sounds wrong, but enhanced in any way? Like, has there been any sort of color balance to make it look more spectacular than it actually does? Like, if I take a photo with a camera outside, the pictures I get back tend to be a lot better than what reality is. Like, the sky is bluer than it actually is. Does that happen when you look at things through a telescope and when it's posted online?
Well, that's a very good question, and the best way I can answer that is, say, at Kitt Peak, what we actually have is our cameras are not color cameras like the color CCDs you might have in your smartphone or even in a digital camera you'd buy at the store. What they are is they're actually black and white cameras, black and white charge coupled devices, CCDs. And what we do to get the color, what we do is we actually put color filters in front of that. And the reason we put color filters in front of it is because what we want to know is the information we want is specifically what wavelength of light is coming through and producing certain patterns on the sky. The way we might make a color image is we might, in the very simplest ways, almost like the old-fashioned print process, you would take essentially a red, green, and a blue image, and you would combine them at roughly equal weights to make a color image. Now, of course, this is not necessarily what your eye is going to see, but it's going to be the sort of color balanced. It's going to be very close to a true color image. Now, what you'll also see, especially if you're looking at a NASA image, is sometimes they will enhance an image to bring out certain features. So they might take this black and white camera and look at it through a filter. The camera might be sensitive a little bit into the infrared, for instance, or a little bit into the ultraviolet. And if that's the case, what they're going to do is they might have they might essentially have a filter in front of it that's letting in infrared light. And of course, we can't see infrared light, but they'll assign that a color, and they'll enhance the image to show that part of the feature. And again, it's not really to make it look better, but to actually see this feature and to understand what's kind of going on in that particular spectrum of the light. And we'll do that sometimes at Kip Peak, where maybe we're trying to emphasize something that's maybe visible in the blue light or in the red light, and we might give that a little brighter appearance in there. But again, that's to specifically enhance something that we're interested in from a scientific point of view. And if you go to the NASA site, or if you go to the Kip Peak site or any observatory site, usually the captions or the articles connected with them will tell you if an enhancement was done and for what purpose it was done. Sometimes if you see the articles as they've come through the popular press, sometimes that information gets left off. So sometimes, yeah, it's good to go back to the source material if you're curious about that.
Okay. So I've met a lot of authors through various social media sites, and they tend to stay with one genre. But so far, I've noticed that you have worked in 3 different genres. What was your decision in doing that? Why you initially started off with science fiction and then went into paranormal? What was the jump for you to make a change like that?
Well, I think first off, a lot of authors I've known have been interested in working in multiple genres, but whether, for however it's come about, the publishing industry has sort of gotten us into the notion that an author is a brand. And, that branding of the authors is sort of how we come to think of, we go look at a Stephen King novel and immediately you're going to assume horror. You look at say let's see, an Arthur Conan Doyle novel, you're going to assume Sherlock Holmes. It's that brand goes with the name in a sense. And a lot of authors have actually, frankly, done this by writing under pseudonyms. But there are a few set of authors who've written in multiple genres that have managed to do it without the pseudonym, and I kind of hope I have managed to pull this off. And this is kind of a long way around as to my, the reason why I write the different genres is because I picked the genre that goes with the story that I want to tell. And so, all of these kind of have a way that I've come to them. I was a science fiction fan since I was a kid. And so, of course, the first thing I kind of went to was science fiction. In fact, science fiction is what kind of drove me to astronomy. Um, but while I was at Kit Peak the first time, as you were talking about at the beginning of the interview, I do work pretty much exclusively at night. I work sunset to sunrise. And so one of my coworkers used to refer to us as the vampires of the mountain. And she was a big fan of Anne Rice, of Bram Stoker, and she got me reading vampire books. And I started thinking, about, could I write a vampire story? And that kind of led me to wanting to explore some of these themes of life and death that seemed really appropriate to the vampire genre. Also tied back into the astronomy, my first job in the field was working for this old observatory, 19th century equipment out on Nantucket Island called Maria Mitchell Observatory. Literally, it was a wind-up clockwork-driven telescope that we used. And so that led to a lot of my interest in things like steampunk. It all kind of ties into like any writer, I think you draw on your life experiences. For me, the multiple genres really came from these different life experiences.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. One of my goals in my writing career is to write in multiple genres because I don't know, I just look at the world around me and I just see all these sorts of stories, but nothing that can fit into one genre. I mean, I could do it if I forced myself, but then I don't think that would be a true representation of myself. I want to tell stories. And while science fiction will always be my first love, and that's what I did my first two books in, I want to write horror, even though I'm not a big fan of horror. I want to write fantasy, even though I'm not a big fan of fantasy. Vampire, well, I'm a big fan of vampires, what can I say? But when I decide what genre I want to do, it's just like that's almost immediately known that's what it's going to be. Um, and it's just comes from my love of stories. I see Lord of the Rings and I think about, how would I write an adventure story on this scale? Or, I watch Star Trek and just kind of the same thing for me. So I can definitely see what you're saying about turning what you have around you and putting it into your stories and not necessarily being restricted that, hey, I wrote sci-fi in the past, that's all I should ever write. Um, I think it was something you said in an interview once. I was reading some of your stuff, but I heard this at Comic-Con where someone said that the best advice for a writer is write what you don't know. Because we often see writers say, well, write what you know, and it's like, where's fun in that? Challenge yourself. Write something that you don't know. And it's like, I don't know anything about fantasy, so I'm going to try to write it.
Right, and that's a very good point because that's in a sense how I made my first professional sale in the field was a short story I sold to Realms of Fantasy magazine in 2001. It was, I had never really written fantasy. I had read some fantasy. I had my little magazine, Hadrosaur Tales was what it was called at the time, and literally what came out was I had a day where for some reason every story that was submitted to me, and this was still in the days where the majority of my submissions were by mail, so these are not people online chatting with each other, just random people from different parts of the country sent me stories about some knight going up to a cave and trying to do in some hapless dragon. And I thought, okay, dragon slaying stories. It's like, and it got to the point where by the end of this day, I think I must have read 4 or 5 of them. I just was sick of dragon slaying stories. And I was, I said, and I, instead of saying, okay, dragon story, and I know a lot of editors will do that and kind of get to the end of that and say, dragon slaying stories are terrible. Dragon slaying stories are done to death. No one's ever going to read another dragon slaying story because everyone's writing them. So I challenged myself. I said, okay, I'm going to write what kind of dragon slaying story could I do that's different? And so I essentially went out and said, okay, well, what if instead of the lone knight, what if there's a whole industry of people out to slay dragons? What if the fuel that dragons use to breathe fire actually is something that people have utilized for lamps or whatever, kind of like whale oil back in the 1800s. And I imagine people going out on these vast airships hunting dragons, and it became this sort of almost I kind of patterned the whole story on Moby Dick, essentially, the mad captain on a quest for the one special dragon that was going to make his career. And and it ended up, like I say, I wrote it down, and I figured, well, it's mostly a pastiche of Moby Dick. I tried selling it to a few small press magazines, and one of them said, well, why don't you try Realms of Fantasy? And sure enough, about 2 weeks after I sent it to them, they bought it, and it became, my first professional sale, and had a beautiful illustration by Mark Harrison that accompanied it, and it's. I still have it available out there. It's you can even though Realms has sadly closed its doors, I went ahead and put the story up as an Amazon short, so it's that's out there and people can read it.
That does sound like a really great story, a fresh take on the genre of dragon hunting, while at the same time paralleling with the classic. I mean, that's just really good. Brain just decided to go away, but no, that sounds really great.
Oh,
But I know what
thanks.
you're talking about with, kind of writing the same story that everyone's doing, and that's one of my concerns right now with writing my vampire story. That it's like, well, everyone's doing vampires. It's something I said in my Kickstarter video. It's like, you can find a book on anything in a bookstore on vampires. The Vampire Diet, or Soylent Red. That was a joke I
Dick and
wanted.
Jane and Vampires.
What's up?
Dick and Jane and Vampires, which is a
Yeah,
fun parody.
I wanted to do the joke Soylent Red, that Soylent Red is vampires, but I thought no one would really get the joke. Um, so it is a concern of mine that I'm basically doing something that in an oversaturated market, and one might argue that maybe I should try doing something else for now and then come back to it later. But it's like, this is the story that's in me right now to write. And I have done so much world building. I have done so much just character creation. And I really do think that my story is going to be a little bit unique as far as the genre goes. And I do keep in mind a lot of what's already been done. Some of it is very, very good, like the Anne Rice stuff and Blade, which is one of my sources of inspiration. And then a lot of it has been done very badly, which we won't mention its name, Twilight. But um, so yeah, that's a very big concern I have of mine, and just talking about what you're talking about there. But it's good that you had that sort of experience, I think, with your magazine, that you're able to see what people were doing and seeing kind of the same thing. It's like, let's make it better. Let's do something unexpected. Not necessarily new, but let's just change it up a little bit.
Right, and I think one of the things you mentioned, I was reading some of what you were talking about your vampire series, about trying to get someplace new, trying to get an explanation for your vampires. That was certainly one of the places I went with mine. I wanted to have a background and actually know where my vampires came from. and have a backstory. I don't necessarily, at the end of Vampires of the Scarlet Order, which chronologically is the second book in the series, I get to where that is, although that's not really the focus of the story. But yeah, I think there's I think it's a real challenge to take something like vampires, which are oversaturated, and I know they're oversaturated. When I'm at conventions, I get one of two reactions when I tell people I write vampires. It's either real excitement because they're a fan of vampires, and they immediately look at the books and pick them up, and either generally, or I'd say most of the people who are really excited about them tend to walk away with one or both of the books. But the other reaction I get is the eye roll. It's like, oh, whatever, sparkly vampires again, or whatever else. It's like, oh, more romantic vampires, and it's like, well, my response is, yeah, my vampire books have romance, but that's partly because I think, the human experience, romance is just part of the human experience, and I'm going to write about that in there, but it's not necessarily the focus of my books. And
As far as I'm sorry, go on.
oh no, go ahead.
Well, as far as romance goes, I don't know. I imagine it's going to be somewhere in there, but I'm not specifically planning it. It's just kind of my approach to writing. If it comes up, it comes up. If it doesn't, well, maybe later it will.
Right. Yeah. As far as, but yeah, the take I took with the vampires, and what I wanted to do to kind of make them fresh was, I started to think what it would be like to actually live forever, to live through periods of history, where a lot of, you have things like the Dark Ages, where pretty much if you're going to be rich, you're going to have hoarded your wealth rather than have it out in banks where, money lenders are going to be stealing from your coffers and things like that. How does, I started approaching it by, how does someone who lives through these horrible times actually stay a sane thinking being through all of this? How do they actually function? And in my case, the vampires basically came to appreciate their strength, their ability, their powers, and they actually use that to be mercenaries for the powers that be. And that's kind of the way I ended up working to make my vampires a bit different from some of the other ones you might see out there.
And I believe my approach to making my vampires different was, and this is not going to be seen in the first few books because it's mostly from the perspective of my knight characters. And how I'm making them different is I'm looking at the social order of vampires as a whole. First off, that there would be many different houses. And one thing that I've seen a lot, which kind of annoys me, but Blade was one of the first instances where I saw differences, is like all of the bad guys are on the same exact side. I've seen this in Vampire Tales, but many other genre movies, it's like if there's a certain species of what the enemy is, it doesn't matter how complex their social order is, they're always on the same side. So I kind of like this idea of houses of the same species, vampire, fighting against each other, fighting for territory, fighting for resources, things like that. But more than just having different clans is how the social order works within these clans. And how is it possible that these vampires stay together and what kind of issues they would be having. Now, I do want to incorporate that into the novel, which is going to be a little bit of a challenge because it does center around these knights trying to fight off a vampire invasion. But I think as they become more familiar with how vampires work, we get to see more of their nature within the story. And I'm hoping through that that will make my story a little bit more unique, that people will want to see how that's possible.
No, that sounds like a very good take on the whole vampire mythos, because I think yeah, especially if vampires are if there are enough vampires to be a society, I think there's a lot to be said for having the conflict in there. At some level, I guess you could say Anne Rice did this on a smaller scale in that she had the vampires that were in charge of each of their cities, and they would threaten the other vampires that would sometimes come in. I'm actually catching up with the Vampire Chronicles and just reading Blood and Gold right now, and there's a which is the Vampire Chronicle that focuses on Marius, and he's just gone through the scenes where he's been in Constantinople and he's threatened by the head vampire there. But that's a much smaller scale than what you're doing, where it's entire houses of vampires in conflict, and I think that adds some potential, even if it's from the eyes of the hunters. Certainly, you could use that. The hunters even maybe figuring this out and maybe playing one group against the other or something. If the vampires are able to be played, maybe that's even one of the things that the vampire hunters learn is maybe the vampires aren't so easily played, or maybe they are. Who knows? That's the fun of exploring these things.
Well, I will say, and it's a little bit of spoiler, but it's coming in my part two of my preview for Kickstarter. Because in the first part that I wrote, the main character Jock was a little bit hesitant about fighting the vampires that he had seen. He didn't want to fight them for a very specific reason, and it's revealed in the second part why that was. The other characters don't know this, but they're actually going to meet a clan of vampire. And this vampire clan is a little bit interesting in that they have no association with any of the other vampires. In fact, they look down upon all other vampires. And I really love this clan because they actually do a lot for the series, even though they're not featured that much in it. But they kind of look at killing their food as being immature and childish. That a vampire doesn't need to kill in order to feed off of humans, and that a responsible vampire should get consent from their victims as far as feeding goes, rather than forcibly take it. So it's a very mature vampire sect, although they're kind of the exception to the rule.
I like that idea, and the yeah. In my case, it's because the vampires are so outnumbered by humans. Even though they're strong, they recognize that they can be outnumbered, overwhelmed, and so they try to hunt carefully. So they try to avoid killing just so that they don't arouse the populations around them as much as anything. And I think that's kind of trying to figure out the reasons that these creatures work the way they do. I think is one of the fascinating things you can do exploring these things as a writer.
And definitely the population control does come to be a central issue when in relation to the Black Plague, which the vampires are spreading. Another little spoiler, but it's going to be kind of a main selling point. It's like, why are vampires spreading this disease around? They're affecting their own food source.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so as much as I love talking about vampires, go ahead and move on. So, do you just write one genre, then move on to the next, or do you kind of intermix it? And what challenges do you have if you're doing two genres at once?
Well, I kind of intermix it, and nowadays it's kind of necessity. Right at the moment, I am under contract to write novels in my Clockwork Legion steampunk series. Lightning Wolves is the newest one that was just released, and that's the one with the wolf on the cover that you saw at Phoenix Comic Con. And I'm getting set to write. I've just finished outlining, and I'm getting settled in to work on The Brazen Shark, which is number 3 in that series. But in the middle of that, my other publisher, the steampunk series is done with Sky Warrior Publishing, but Lakis Publishing, my other publisher, came to me with this idea for a horror series that I thought was. They said, "Would you like to write a horror novel? You can write anything you want to write about." And I said, "Well, I work at this observatory, and it's basically this skyscraper, and I'm more or less one of. Oftentimes, I'm the only person in this huge, kind of scary building at night. What if you actually imagine this place populated by ghosts, and what if some ancient evil were unleashed in this place? Certainly I've been through there and heard different creaks and groans as the wind howls through the place. So, I ended up going between the steampunk and the horror just very recently, swapping gears between them. In a smaller scale, I've often been known to, in the middle of a novel, to leap out of it to write a short story that I may have been invited to for an anthology, or maybe I've seen a magazine a set of guidelines for a special issue that looked really interesting, and I'll kind of jump out of genre to do that. And I find it's not too difficult to do. I kind of can't, sort of in the same day sit there and jump back and forth, like write steampunk in the morning and horror in the afternoon. I find that very difficult. But say if I'm with this 1 week on, 1 week off day job schedule I have, it is actually pretty easy for me to come home, write for a week on the steampunk novel, and then say, well, I'm ahead of schedule now, go up to work, kind of clear my head, and then come back home and then write something in the horror genre or in the science fiction genre. And I find that I can kind of do that. I kind of have to have that head cleaning, head clearing phase in the middle of it, but I can kind of do that as long as I get myself in the headspace of that particular genre.
That's awesome. All right, so beyond your 8 books, I see on your website and on Amazon that you've also done anthologies as well. What's your experience been with that?
Well, I did 2 anthologies for Flying Pen Press. Unfortunately, Flying Pen Press has decided that to get out of the fiction business, and those 2 anthologies are no longer in print. But their series was the Full Throttle Space Tales series, and the whole idea was to be high action, high octane science fiction stories set around certain themes. And I edited space pirates and space horrors for them, and pretty much the titles are pretty self-explanatory. Space pirates are stories all about piracy in space, and I invited people to write stories on that theme, and I was lucky enough, I think it's 15 stories in that, to get 15 really wonderful tales from people like Neil Asher and Dan Hoyt and Alan Lickus and David Boop and C.J. Henderson. They all turned in some really wonderful stories. The second one I did for them was basically, originally it was going to be titled Space Vampires, but we decided we'd actually expand it and just make all kinds of, the blending of hard science fiction and any kind of horror element. So we have space zombies, and we have space vampires, and we have we actually have alien menaces, and kind of explored that through all the different realms we could. Other volumes in that series are Space Sirens, which Carol Heitschuh edited. There's Space Grunts, which is basically military science fiction, edited by Dayton Ward, and then Space Battles, which is different military confrontations in space that Brian Thomas Schmidt edited, and Space Tramps, which Jennifer Brozek edited. And, they're all just a lot of fun. And I wrote stories for all of them except for Space Grunts, and that was merely because I had too many things going on right at the time, and I just couldn't make the deadline for it. Who knows whether the story idea I had would have made it or not, but I didn't get a story turned in for that one. But all the rest of them I did, and all except for Space Horrors, my stories in those are all kind of tied into the whole Old Star New Earth series, and they're basically stories with my space pirates, sort of expanding that whole universe. But the experience of editing the anthologies was just a whole lot of fun. It was fun to see where different authors came. You'd present this theme and just kind of see where they went with it. The third anthology I edited is called A Kepler's Dozen. And this was one where one of the astronomers I work with came to me, and he had worked at Kitt Peak National Observatory, and he got a job as the project scientist for the Kepler probe, NASA's Kepler probe. And they had just started discovering, I think at the time he came up with the idea, they had just discovered the first potentially Earth-like planet with Kepler. And he thought, what if we took science fiction writers and let them imagine what the Kepler planets are like? Give them sort of all the scientific parameters we kind of know about the planets that have been discovered so far, and let them tell stories about them. And they might not necessarily be Earth-like planets, but just let them kind of go with that. And this became A Kepler's Dozen, and Steve and I co-edited it. And the way that co-editing process worked was essentially Steve read the stories for scientific accuracy and commented on them and worked with the authors to make them make sure they're as close to what we knew about the planets as possible. And then I edited them for grammar, spelling, line editing, consistency of the stories. And we deliberately went out to get 13 stories, and I think we ended up with 13 very good stories. And that's really been by far, I think, one of the most successful anthologies I've done. I think the idea of it's really like going back to the 19th century and the wealth of fiction about Mars that came out in the wake of Percival Lowell's now we know mistaken discovery of canals on Mars and writing stories about the Martians. Here's real science actually happening, and letting science fiction writers kind of imagine what these places are actually like. And I think it turned out to be a very good anthology.
So you mentioned your Old Star New Earth, which, if I'm correct, was your first series. And in looking at that, I noted that after you wrote books 1 and 2, there was a 6-year gap before you started writing book 3. And I was wondering if you could kind of explain what that gap was.
Well, the whole story of the Old Star New Earth books is kind of a long one, but I will to make it fairly brief and to kind of give an idea of where the gap was. I first sold The Pirates of Sufiro to a publisher in Canada. Was very much a very traditional book sale. I had found an agent through a writers' conference, and she shopped the book around and got me in with this publisher in Canada. And the short answer is, what happened with that book what happened with that publisher is it turned out that publisher and that agent were actually colluding for a lot of other authors to have this whole scam operation going on. You can actually read about the case on places like there's a case study at Science Fiction Writers of America, Writer Beware. The agent was Dorothy Deering, and the publisher was Commonwealth Publications. I actually was one of the lucky ones. I actually saw a book published. I actually saw it in bookstores, at least local ones. Who knows whether they shipped anywhere besides my local market. But I do see these pop up on eBay from time, copies come up from eBay. So I think they made it into at least a few other bookstores. But anyway, short answer is, once I found out that I had an agent who was defrauding authors by getting them to pay enormous sums of money to this publisher. And of course, here I am. I got a pretty decent contract out of them. It was no money up front, but I really, they had actually produced my books. They looked pretty good. They had actually edited them. It all looked like a completely legitimate small press kind of operation. And so I was mindlessly, people would come to me and ask me about them, and the red flag didn't come up till it's like someone said, gee, they asked me for $10,000, and I was like, what? What's going on here? Of course, money should flow to the author. Money should not flow from the author. And when I found this out, basically that's when I fired my agent. I ended up going in on a class action lawsuit, got my rights to the book back, self-published the first book. About this time, it was all through the process of this was when I wrote the second book. So I had the first and the second book. So essentially what I did was I said, okay, Commonwealth had such a bad reputation. I'm not going to get anyone to seriously look at these books. I'm just going to self-publish them, come of them what may. And I went on and I wrote my first vampire book. I'd been writing vampire short stories kind of throughout and selling to a lot of the small press vampire markets, places like The Vampire's Crypt and then Night to Dawn, and getting some people kind of interested in developing a little bit of some enthusiasm about these stories. And so I ended up putting together my first novel, which was Vampires of the Scarlet Order. And so what I had done was I had started shopping that around. And a friend of mine got a job as art director for this press, LBF Books. And he recommended me to the editor of LBF Books, the publisher, who at the time was Jacqueline Druga Marchetti. And she read Vampires, loved it, and acquired it. And the first thing she asked me is, what else do you have? And I said, well, I have these two self-published books, which had now been out and self-published for a couple of years at this point. And she read those, and she really liked them as well. And so she went ahead and took those books. And so it was after I essentially had resold the Old Star, New Earth books, after I had sold Vampires of the Scarlet Order, that I then basically had, she said, okay, we've got these first two books, can you write a third one that's exclusive for us? And that's where I ended up writing. So I started writing the final book, Heirs of the New Earth, basically when I sold those first two books. So that's where the gap in time came from. It was just the machinations of going through the initial publishing of the first book and getting the rights back and then reselling it.
Yeah, you're talking about that scam there, and it kind of reminded me of one that I sort of faced. I didn't really get into it, but I got close. And I think the website was called poetry.com. I don't remember too well, but it was like I submitted a poem to their website to be reviewed by many people. And it's one of the best poems I ever wrote. Wish I still had a copy of it, but and then they're like, oh, well, you've won this contest where you'll get your poem published in a book. And I'm like, oh, fantastic. My first, anthology credit, my first credit as being a writer or a poet. And then I actually started looking into it a lot more and realized that it was a scam, that yes, I would be published in this book, and I would have to pay like $100 to get a copy of this book, which kind of raised a red flag for me right there. It's like, shouldn't I get a free copy of it? Or I don't know how it all worked back then, but and that other people had made complaints about this, that it was basically a scam to get money for your own work, basically.
Yeah, poetry.com is really infamous, and yeah, in fact, my story with them is almost exactly the same as yours, but it was after I had dealt with the whole business with Commonwealth Publishing, and by then it's like, yeah, I got the letter that was asking for money, and it immediately threw up the red flag, and that's when, by then the internet was starting to really come out a little bit more, and I think that has done a lot to really make it hard for publishers to scam writers. Unfortunately, there are still a lot of people who will merrily do it. Merrily try to get money from authors to publish their work, and that's just because I think authors are so hungry to get it out there. And I think there is a lot of value to going out and getting your work properly critiqued. Even if you do go the self-publishing route, go find a good, honest editor, and there's a lot of people who will do that for reasonable rates out there. Go find people to work with you to bring the best product you can to market. And the people who will charge this will not be charging thousands of dollars to do this. They'll be charging something that you can afford, because they're looking to make an honest living as well.
Okay, so going a little bit into your Old Star, New Earth series, um, you being very scientifically minded, I imagine I haven't actually read the series. I tried to review it a little bit, but I'm imagining, since you're dealing with a spaceborne society, that you had to deal with the issues of faster than light travel. And what ways did you resolve that for your book? Did you say, well, you know what, science doesn't say anything about this, so let's throw out the science and say people can travel than that? Or did you use some actual scientific principle?
Well, I don't really describe it a lot. It does get into it a little bit in the second book, and what I'm doing is essentially I kind of make use of a couple of cheats that are allowed, and one is that the principle of faster, you can't go faster than light. Well, first off, one of the cheats here is what science actually says is that you cannot go at the speed of light, because all the equations go to infinity. It basically everything blows up right at the speed of light. The relativity actually has no problem with things going faster than light, because everything starts converging the faster and faster you go beyond the speed of light. It's that critical moment. Um, the other thing is this is a confine of the physical laws of our universe. Well, what would happen if you could basically step outside or form a bubble universe around yourself? Then it allows you to actually move along, essentially the various wave patterns of the universe, and various you have the various wave velocities that you have and some of those actually, if you I'm having one of those. It's been so long since I've actually done the whole physics of waves thing that I'm forgetting the exact terminology here. But basically, but there are cheats you can use to basically move along waves at speeds faster than light. And my my basic way of doing this was basically they form essentially bubble universes around themselves and transport themselves from one position to another, moving essentially parallel and outside the three dimensions that we normally think of as the three spatial dimensions. In fact, general relativity goes on into several other dimensions beyond the three dimensions. It doesn't just assume that those exist, and so I kind of play with that, and I do it in kind of a hand wavy way, because if I go into it in great detail, I'm going to end up writing a physics textbook and not a science fiction book. So that was kind of my approach to it. Was I wanted people to go across the galaxy, and in fact, one of the because they travel from essentially gravitational node to gravitational node, and that's a fancy way of saying big gravitational source like a star. What this means is solar systems around the galaxy are well explored. The space between stars is not well explored in this universe. So the vast majority of the galaxy, which is empty space, is actually not really well known space in this universe. It's just the space around solar systems that becomes well explored, and that becomes they end up finding that there are portals to some of the places, some of the other extragalactic objects in some of this empty space. But it turns out that's very difficult to get to. So it ends up being kind of a factor in the way I treat the books.
So, taking the science portion and moving into your Vampires of the Scarlet Order, what conflicts did you have with magic versus science?
Oh, in there, what I get into is the whole Clark's Law idea that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And so, really, my vampires are not so much magical as they are a product of a really advanced technology. And I won't say too much more than that, because that will get into some spoilers for Vampires of the Scarlet Order. But it turns out that the part I will say is what the vampires do come to realize is that they came about through creatures tampering with humans to essentially do genetic engineering and modification to bring about the skills and abilities of the vampire. And that's essentially how they come about in this world. And like I say, I won't get into too many more details, but
That's
that's big.
that's actually going to be an element that's featured in my book, because the vampire culture is about 500 years more advanced than humans at the current time. So the vampires, well, the humans are in the 1300s, so the vampires kind of are in the 1800s. And I attribute that because, well, they live for a very long time. They don't have to kind of start over every new generations like humans do. And plus, they don't have any of the social construct like the Dark Ages saying that science is bad. They can explore that and really see what it is. There is a little bit of genetic manipulation, even though they don't understand genetics quite that well yet, but they understand a lot more than humans do. That is featured within the series. In fact, the second book of the series goes into that. I won't say how, because that's still kind of the draw of the book. I don't want to give away any spoilers, but that is a prominent scene. But my working with magic, because I've often disliked magic systems that I see in fantasy. We're supposed to just accept that it exists. We don't need any explanation whatsoever that we have magic. And it's like, you could say that your FTL system was magic, but you attempted to explain it just a little bit. You at least said, okay, here's where the beginning of our understanding comes from in this. We don't really need to go into all the full details of it. But with magic, in many systems, in many books I've read, it's like, we have magic, just accept it. It'll be easier if you accept it. That way the rest of the story makes sense. And it's like, oh, no, not really. I'm still wondering, okay, where's this coming from? How are you able to do this? So with my series, I don't explore magic right away as far as where its origin is, but there is an origin to it, and I'll go into it just a little bit. I don't want to touch too much into it, but um, It's basically centers around the four um, functional forces: weak, strong, magnetic, and damn, I feel bad that I don't remember the fourth one.
Okay, we gravity
Electromagnetic,
would be the other one. Yes.
gravity, and electromagnetic. So realistically, all they're doing is manipulating these four forces. But there's a fifth element that I actually call chi, but it's something that's found within the blood system of all living things. That there's some sort of connection there that allows it to manipulate. Now, this being alternate history begs the questions like, why hasn't man ever figured this out? And it's like, well, in humans, it's actually very weak.
Mm.
And in vampires, it's very strong. They evolved around chi so they can manipulate forces a lot easier than man. But there are some ways that man can work around that, which I won't get into because that will be a little bit of spoilers. But um, you know, being a science sci-fi writer, one of my challenges in going into fantasy is my innate desire to explain everything. I have to understand it, even if it doesn't make it into the final book. I have a complete understanding of how everything works.
Yeah, and I found that when I was doing the fantasy short stories, sort of the same sort of thing. I really wanted to understand how things worked. I really wanted to, it might not be explained to the reader, but I needed to understand how it worked. And I think, even if you're creating a true magical system, I think you can separate the ones that work well from the ones that don't, in the sense of maybe it doesn't have a scientific explanation, but the author has self-consistent magical explanation for how it works. Even in my steampunk, I came at my steampunk wanting to do it very much from a technological steampunk point of view. A lot of steampunk is done almost as with kind of a magical point of view. But I've read some where there are zombies and the zombies really aren't explained, and I've read some I've read some that definitely have a very, the automata are powered from some kind of very magical, etheric substance that's put in them, and it's not clear to me that the author knew what that was or how that would even work. And I really wanted to have, if we have a technology, I wanted it to be something that could at least theoretically be achievable. And of course, I kind of got to my marvelous steampunk inventions by a little bit of a cheat, by actually having an advanced alien come in, and in the case of the Russians building technology, um, actually confers with Dmitry Mendeleev, who you might remember is the guy who developed the periodic table, and but was around at the period of these books. And so yeah, I like to know what's actually going on in the books and what's going on behind the scenes. And for me, I like to have a physical explanation, even if the physics might be a little far out or a little speculative, so to speak.
Okay, so you've done, you did science fiction, you did some paranormal, you did a variety of other genres, but then you did the steampunk like you're mentioning. And you talked a little bit about being in the observatory from the 19th century. But was that your only inspiration for doing steampunk, to decide to go into steampunk, or was there anything else that led you to decide, okay, I've done these over here, now it's time to do steampunk?
I think steampunk ended up being a real convergence of a lot of things for me. Even going back to being a kid, when I was a kid, the movie The Hindenburg came out, which introduced me to airships. I grew up in Southern California. You saw the Goodyear blimp flying overhead. I was an airship geek, from when I was a kid, and I really wanted to. I loved airships in particular, and always wanted to kind of use them in a story somehow. Um, Beyond that, also when I was a kid, my dad was a big lover of American history, and he was fortunate enough to be a supervisor in the railroad, Santa Fe Railroad, and would get fairly long vacation blocks, and we would use these to just take these wonderful trips all around the country, and at some level when I was 8 and 9 years old, these there were elements of these trips that bored me, but it stuck with me and became a real love of history, and how sort of America came about, and even broader, how the world came about, and because he was with the railroad, my dad and my granddad started out both actually apprenticing on steam locomotives. So steam power was still very much part of what they were doing when they were getting started in their careers. So, when I had the opportunity to work on this 19th century telescope, it really kind of opened my eyes to how viable this technology still is, and what you can use it for, how you could have expanded it and thought about it. And so what happened was, just from my own interest, my own fandom in things like the Wild Wild West, the TV show with Robert Conrad from the '60s, which I grew up with, from even spaghetti westerns, the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly with Clint Eastwood. It had just long been in my mind that to do kind of a weird western, as they were known, as they're also known. Steampunk really kind of goes more Victorian England, and I think what a lot of people think of. I kind of came into this more from this weird western side, and wanting to kind of write, what would happen if you took a western and infused it with this technology and with these sort of strange events. And it just finally came to a point where I just had to write this story. And I ended up being caught up in some of the real historical events. I grew up in Southern California, but over time I had lived in Arizona and in New Mexico. In fact,
I'm sorry. I'm sorry
oh,
that you had to live in Arizona.
well, it was a good time for the time I had, but I really, my heart's in New Mexico, and no, I enjoyed my time in Tucson, and but I can appreciate that some of the politics of Arizona are problematic, shall we say at best. We won't diverge too far into that arena. But no, it's but I had encountered Tombstone, Arizona, and of course all the lore around what happened with the gunfight at OK Corral, which really was just kind of a feud that led into even bigger actual events around Arizona politics itself. It was really a fight between the Democrats and the Republicans trying to control the Cochise County at the time. Was where a lot of the whole Clanton Earp feud came from. It was just kind of a fascination with all of this. Here in New Mexico, Pat Garrett's buried a quarter mile that direction, like behind my back door. It's like, how can you not kind of get interested in this? Billy the Kid's trial was back that way, maybe about 2 miles, where he killed the one guy he is actually known to have killed. That's I can diverge and geek out about all the different history in this area, but it's just the fascination with it. I finally just had to write about it, and of course, loving the technology, I had to infuse it with the technology, and that's where I ended up writing the steampunk books. And in fact, while the first two are very much Wild West steampunk, the third one's actually going to take a little bit of a turn, and it's going to move and take place mostly in Japan and Russia. and that's the brazen shark is going to be kind of get away from the whole Wild West setting and actually kind of get into this sort of Asian setting, which I think will give it a little bit different, little bit of a different flavor.
Something you said that I really liked. You were talking about how, this observatory that had technology from the 19th century is still viable. And I think that a lot of times a mistake that is made in fiction is this assumption that something that is older is inferior to something that is newer. That you have this old technology over here that worked for them in the past, but in the future we have something that's far better, so it makes this thing obsolete. And it's like, not necessarily. I mean, yeah, we have something better for it, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it still doesn't have its use, or that if you were stranded and you had this one thing, that you couldn't still do something that the other thing would have allowed you to do.
Well, and here's a very specific to do with that telescope. One of the things that that telescope did very well, it was manufactured by one of the master telescope makers of its day, a fellow named Alvin Clark. And I like to think of Alvin Clark as the true mad scientist of the Victorian age, because he built not only the world's largest telescope, but then he went and topped himself and built the world's even bigger telescope, and then he built an even bigger telescope than that, and to this day the biggest one he built is still the world's largest refracting telescope at Yerkes Observatory in Wisconsin. But he built these all around the world, different size telescopes. This one I worked on was not one of his larger telescopes. It was a 10-inch camera. But what was special about it was it had a very large field of view. It was literally the old-fashioned glass plates, like you might see, the pictures of someone in an old movie, putting the hood over their head and, pulling the slide out to take the exposure. That's literally, we didn't have the hood because we were operating all in darkness, in the closed dome, but we would start the exposure by yanking out this big dark slide and sit there and take the picture for half an hour or an hour, whatever the exposure time was, put the slide back in, take it down, and develop the picture. But these plates were about this big. Think about the size of the chip in your digital camera, in your cell phone camera. The chip in this is tiny, and it's only been recent that we've gotten decent sized chips, but still, the chips in the cameras at telescopes, the biggest ones are mosaics that are maybe 4 inches by 4 inches, something like that is what you kind of find on these things, as compared to the glass plates that you would have on telescopes that could be a foot, a couple feet wide, and just would get these enormous large areas of the sky. So what we were doing at this observatory on Nantucket was they had 100 years worth of data, people who had taken these glass plates over 100 years, all very consistent. So it allowed me in 1987 to use this 19th century technology to discover a variable star that no one had seen before, just because we had this long history of consistent data, and also because we had these plates with wide fields of view. They may have been exposing a star, and in fact, for the variable star I was using, they were looking at a different star in the field. I actually ended up looking at a star that just happened to be captured on that plate, and that's how I ended up discovering this variable star, because they had this real wide field of view. And we're only just now, in terms of technology, being able to get these kinds of wide field CCDs. The 1-degree imager at Kitt Peak is going to be one of the first cameras that's going to have anything like this kind of field of view when it's when all of the chips in the mosaic are in it. So here we are, beginning of the 21st century, just beginning to sort of get. Now, of course, with the technology, we get much higher resolution. We get to see it in much more detail than we were in the 19th century. But we're just now being able to see that with that high resolution, with that field of view that we had way back in the 19th century. So that's, I think that's kind of an exciting thing.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. Still really goes on that whole assumption is that just because it's older doesn't mean that it's useless.
Oh,
So
absolutely.
for any writers out there, just kind of remember that it's like, if you feature old technology in your like a relic of the past, don't make it that it's doesn't have a use or a function, and that might actually bring out something interesting in your story. It's like, hey, this thing still works and actually is a little bit better than what we have now in some ways. So something to keep out there for all you writers. So kind of answered most of the questions that I had about you yourself and your series. And what I love about these interviews is you end up answering a lot of questions and not realize it. But let's go into the process itself. So, how do you go from an idea in your head to it being on the bookshelf?
Well, for me, because I live in New Mexico and I work in Arizona, I actually have, with this 1 week on, 1 week off shift, and when I'm up there, because I get 80 hours in essentially a 6-day shift, I'm up there, staying up there the whole time. What this means is I have a nice long drive from Las Cruces, New Mexico to Kitt Peak, Arizona, every week. And so the process for me of starting with an idea is often while I'm sitting there driving, I'll just sit there and start kind of plotting out ideas. I'll start thinking about who's doing what, and asking how does this relate to this other person? How does if character A does something, what's character B going to do? And I just start plotting out these scenarios, and it kind of becomes the beginning of an outline. I kind of almost equate what I do on these long drives, and I'll even do it when I'm at home. I'll just go out for long walks in the neighborhood and just kind of start mulling over these ideas. It's kind of like, it really is outlining, but it's outlining the way a storyteller tells a story. I get to a point where I kind of envision what's going on in the novel before I really start setting down words on the computer, so that I kind of almost picture it as something that's happened in the past. Maybe it's like I might tell you a story about Billy the Kid and Pat Garrett, that I've read in a book, and I can relate that to you as something that I know happened. The whole idea is I try to get myself into the frame of mind where this is as though the story is something that actually happened, and I'm just here to tell you what that was. So when I actually sit down and start writing, it's actually a very easy process, because I've actually got that going around in my mind, that this is something that I've already envisioned, that it's happened, and my job is just to fill in all the details and paint the picture as completely, so you who doesn't see what I see as a bunch of facts can actually picture it, hopefully as well as I can. So I do start with essentially an outline process. I kind of write down major plot points just to keep myself straight, and then I sit down and start writing. Once the novel's written, I set it aside for a little bit of time, maybe share it with some friends who act as beta readers, get that all back, get their comments back, kind of try to evaluate whether there are things that work for me or not, um, apply those, and then lately my books have been ones that publishers have solicited from me. So at that point, I pretty much know right who I'm sending it to. In the early days, it would then be the process of proofreading it just as carefully as I could, and then sending it off, and hopefully having someone take a look at it. But nowadays, yeah, I send it off to my editor and hope they're not going to totally pass out from what I sent them, and hope they like it, and treat it favorably. And so far, it's been pretty positive on that.
I'll use a technique a little bit similar to your own. Um, for example, the Dagar Legacy. I've been thinking about this story for the last 4 years. It was only like a little over 2 years ago that I decided to start my writing career. Of course, that story back then was very different than what it is now. About the only commonality is like the first four parts that I'm writing now. It was back then. And I do think about some of the major plot points, and I do write those down, but that's about all of the outlining I do with my stories. And I do a lot of character work. I go like to such an extreme level in designing characters and the relationships with each other, but I mostly just play to my head like a movie. Like I see these scenes going on and I just play them over and over again. And well, I'll admit it, I sometimes act out these scenes by myself. Like I'm in a room, just sounds like I'm talking to myself, but I'm not. I'm perfectly sane. But I'm playing these scenes out and working on them and like, okay, let's change this line and that. And I've probably, like the first part that I put up there, I've probably gone through that like 50 times with dialogue different every single time just to really understand the scene. But even though I've done that for that one scene, I really haven't done it for the rest of the book. I kind of know what's going to happen. I just start with a very good foundation and then kind of just build off of that. And that's kind of how I differ from you, but I kind of still do what you're doing, where I really think about some of the scenes that I want to see happen in the book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that visualizing, I think the visualization process really is a helpful process, because it allows you to start kind of doing the reality checking on your characters. As if you're sort of watching the movie in your head as it plays out, and if, say, you don't believe it, how can you expect your readers to believe it? And maybe that's the time you ask, did I just take a left turn there, and should I adjust course and make this work in a more effective way? Did someone just do something that they shouldn't have done, or did I force something to happen that shouldn't have happened? And oftentimes that's, I think, what we do as writers, is when things don't work, it's because we force something to happen. And of course, sometimes what happens when I'm playing, this virtual movie through my head is, the characters will go off and do something, I didn't expect. They'll do something, and oftentimes it's better than what I had initially planned to do. And it's great when it happens in the early phase. It's a little bit annoying sometimes when it happens after I have an outline down. But I do find it part of the fun part of the challenge, is to okay, now, okay, they've broken my outline. How do I, can I get back on the track of the outline, or are they taking me in a different place? And I have been known to completely re-outline the end of a book, because the characters took me into some place that I found a lot more interesting than where I was going in the first place.
Well, that's one of the main reasons why I don't do the whole outline phase, because I've met some writers who will like plan every major and minor detail of their story, and I've tried doing that, and then it's like I've somehow challenged myself to find a way to change it. So I just really let my characters go. And the way I look at it is I'm more of a DM doing a Dungeons and Dragons game, and I'm just telling them, okay, here's the situation. What do you do? and they tell me what to do, and they surprise me all the time because I have no real outline. I have a general guideline of where the story's going. I'm always surprised by how it turns out, and I sometimes wonder, am I actually writing this story? Because I'm not really planning anything and things are happening. Am I really the creative mind here?
Yeah, and uh, had the fortune in high school to meet Ray Bradbury, and he described it as, what would happen is he would basically go into a room with his typewriter and he would just follow his characters around, writing down what they did. He really had nothing to do with being involved in it at all. He said that was, being a writer's easy. You just follow what your characters do.
Yeah, I actually learned that technique from Stephen King and was in his book on writing. And
Mm-hmm.
when I read that, I'm like, oh my God, that's exactly what I've been doing, and I've just been fighting it the whole time. And it's like, how about I just let that happen? And I found that my writing improved so much.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's a great book. I really like Stephen King's on writing. It's I only really discovered that about I guess it's now been about 2 years ago. But yeah, I really enjoyed that one when it was handed to me, and it's like, oh yeah, that made a lot of things make a lot of sense.
I think I've had it for about 6 years now. I'm not really sure when I got my hands on it, but it's Joanna Penn's book, How to Market a Book, is like the most important book. But when it comes to actually how to write a book, I always say you have to read this book. I don't agree with everything in there, but it is like every time I used to have this tradition that every time I decided to try to write again, I would read this book all the way through. And now it's like every now and then I'll pick it up and just read a section of it off. It's about the only Stephen King book that I've read that I actually like. Most others, well, let's just say I've read all of the Dark Tower books and I'm like, King, what is your frickin' problem? You are a horrible, horrible man. Not all of them were bad. Some of them were really good, but it's just like I want to strangle him for the way he ended the series. So we gotta move on though. We're coming to the end. We're running a little bit over time here. Not a big deal, but let's go ahead and get through the rest of these. So what are some tools and resources that you use to write? Do you use a word processor? Do you just do everything with pen and paper? Do you use any sort of special tools to help you formulate your ideas or connect everything together?
Well, as far as the basic tool is the word processor, and most of my composition happens on the laptop that I'm talking to you on right now. I think the laptop is absolutely that's absolutely the most wonderful, helpful machine I've ever had, because I take it with me to work at the observatory. I carry it around with me. It's if I've got an idea, I can just pull out the laptop and start putting notes in it. In my early phases of books, I'll often just open up a file and just sort of start spewing out sentences. This idea, that idea. If an idea comes to me, I'll do that. Obviously, if I'm doing the long drive from Arizona to New Mexico, I'll stop somewhere before I do that. But it's that's a lot of it is I just start with these files of just ideas, and then I've done all kinds of different ways as far as outlining and putting things together. Sometimes I have done, for Pirates of Sufiro, my very first book, the outline I worked from was 2 pages handwritten. It was just, essentially it was, here's what's going to happen in part one, here's what's going to happen in part two, here's what's going to happen in part three, and here's how it's going to end. And that was all I did to write from it, and all the rest was basically just short of stream of consciousness kind of stuff. When I came to Children of the Old Stars, I got about halfway through and felt like I had written myself into a hole. And I literally sat down with that one day. I just got a bunch of post-it notes, and I just sat there and started writing down plot points, and I just started putting them, essentially on the wall. just, here's this plot point, here's the next one, here's the next one. No, that needs to happen before this, and I just started shuffling those around until I ended up actually having an idea of how I got from point A to point B. And again, that was one of those books where the characters went off in a different direction, and effectively that became a re-outline of the book. On more recent books, the Astronomer's Crypt was kind of an exciting one because that was one of the first where I outlined the book, but I basically shared my outline with my editor as I was doing it. So I would send it to her, and she would ask questions, and that would put in new plot points in the whole thing. And probably that's the closest book I ended up writing to the outline, but that's because I really had a very complete picture of what the book was going to be like. But it felt very much like the process of I was following the characters around and letting them lead me to where they were going. And, it was more Joanna would step in and say, well, what are they doing over here? Or what happens when this person does something, and it's like, oh, that becomes now another section of this chapter, and I'd fill that in. And by the time I was done, I had something like a 10-page outline for the book, for what was what's ultimately kind of a short novel. But I think hopefully but that hopefully that one will hopefully, I still had places where characters surprised me, where, as I was writing through it, I would ask, why is, I have some drug dealer characters in it. Well, how did these characters become the drug dealers in it, for instance? And, well, okay, here's this character's childhood in Juarez, and you end up actually kind of developing a little bit of a sympathy for this villainous character in the piece that I think wasn't there in my outline, so that when he ultimately meets whatever fate he meets, you might have a mix of emotions over that. And I think again, that's part of the writing process that I think is fun. As far as tools, other tools, my coffee maker is an important one. Got to have the writer caffeined up. I think research tools are essential. I live just a few blocks away from our really good local library. I'll use Wikipedia essentially as a first resource. Okay, let me find out where to start researching this idea. And I find that's where something like Wikipedia is really good, because anyone can edit it, trust it about as far as you can throw it. But you can go into Wikipedia and you can kind of say, okay, here are the relevant things I need to search for, and then I can actually go on, because they have their entire card catalog online these days. I can then go and look for those topics and see what books they have on those subjects, and I can go and actually read in depth the scholarship I might need for a historical period or a particular scientific topic or whatever else it is that I might want to look for in a book. So the library is a very valuable tool in there. And really friends and family as far as reading the books and giving me feedback. I really rely on that very heavily, to know what's sort of working and what's not, and have people ask those, kind of like the feedback with my editor on the outline. Once the book's written, you should always be careful about having family read your manuscripts, but given that I think my family has learned that it's okay not to spare my feelings. So, they ask those pesky questions about why did this happen, and gee, that didn't make sense to me. And I think that's very important after the initial creative process is done to go back and revise the books. And of course, my editors then will do that as well. And I think one book that was my editor, Phyllis Irene Radford, who edited Lightning Wolves, pointed me to, and I really found very helpful, was a book called The 10% Solution by Ken Rand. And it's just a little tiny book, but I found it actually a very good book for looking for some of those real practical things, like, gee, I've used, how do I see that I've used the same word 10 times on a page? Totally unconsciously. If I read it to myself, I might not see it because I'm still in the same headspace I was when I'm writing it. But if I read it aloud, oh gee, that suddenly pops it out to pops it out and makes it apparent. And he actually points out some of the things that you can do. Microsoft Word is very good at. You just do the search function in Microsoft Word and let it highlight a lot of the common kind of annoying words. And he suggests, if you find you use a word too much, do a search on that and see, how often you use it on a page in a chapter. One of my guilty words is however as a transition. And I found I used that way too much in Owl Dance in the first time I went through that, and I had to cut out a lot of them. And even when the second edition came out, I ended up cutting out even more of them. But that was one of those things that Ken Rand was really effective at showing me that I could use this tool to see where they were and use it as a way to kind of cut those words out.
One of my words that I use too much is really.
Yeah, and ly words are a dangerous word. I'm kind of one of those people. There are some folks out there that will say that adverbs shouldn't even be part of a writer's toolkit. But my take is adverbs are part of the English language. We should use them. But I think I think it's even as Stephen King says in On Writing, the key is adverbs are the kinds of words that really stand out. So you use them when it counts and use them effectively. But the minute you start having 10 on a page, you're gonna it's just gonna sound wrong.
Actually, Stephen King is famous for saying that when you finish writing a book, look for all of the words with ly in them and remove them.
Right.
Which then I joke with, well, what about yellow?
Uh-huh. And actually, in the case of that, he kind of pokes fun at himself in there, in that he says to do that, and then he presents one of his examples where he did that, and then he even says, he leaves a couple of the ly words in there, and he says, yeah, notice I actually ignored my own advice, and it was the ly words, and I can't remember what other word he had said he always cut out and he left in there. And it's like, well, yeah, sometimes it works, and sometimes you've got to, sometimes you ignore these grand rules, and
Well,
it's knowing how to do it judiciously is what matters.
well, I actually, and I plan to do an article on the adverbs, but I looked at, I guess I had about a list of 100 of them, of these kinds of words, and I found that only 70% of the time does it end in ly. And that's
Mm.
actually a misconception people have, that these words only end in ly. And it's like, no, that's not actually true. I do understand the point that Stephen King's making, and what I tend to do is that when I'm done with the writing piece, I'll look for words that end in ly and then reread the sentence and say, is it absolutely necessary for me to use the word here, or can I change it into something else to make the sentence better?
And actually, a good point my editor Phyllis made was, sometimes when you use an adverb, and Ken Rand makes this in the book too, sometimes what happens is you used an adverb with a really simple verb. Could you have used a more evocative verb that could have been a simpler and better way of doing the adverb verb combination? And sometimes that can make some interesting variants in your writing.
I also liked what you said about Wikipedia, and I have some people who are like, "Oh, I hate Wikipedia. It's the worst thing ever. People just make stuff up on there. You should never use Wikipedia." I'm like, that is the dumbest thing I've ever heard. I mean, yes, true, people can, write at whatever they want, but, I like your approach because that's the approach I use it as. It's the beginning of your research. Look at it, see what it has to say, and review the information that it has. And the nice thing about Wikipedia is it takes multiple sources and puts it into one. Then you look up that stuff individually just to make sure that Wikipedia has it right, or, even then, Wikipedia more or less summarizes things as well. But you shouldn't ignore a resource because the potential that it could be wrong. You go and double check that resource.
Oh, exactly. And sometimes, because like you say, Wikipedia is a summary resource. Oftentimes you go and look up the more detailed, in-depth research that someone did and published, hopefully in a reviewed, at least by their editor, way. You often find more details and more depth of things than you found at the Wikipedia resource.
So I want you to use your imagination a little bit. I don't know how comfortable you feel about using your imagination being a writer and all,
Oh, yeah.
but I want you to give us a character, whether it's a character in your own books, something you saw in a movie, something you saw in a TV show, something you read in another book. I want you to think about one character and I want you to tell me about them.
Okay, well, I'm just going to pull out Ramon Morales. He's the protagonist of the Clockwork Legion steampunk series. And when we meet Ramon, what we find is he is sheriff of the small town of Socorro, New Mexico, which actually wasn't such a small town as Old West towns go in that time because it was actually kind of a mining center. But it was a boom town. It was a town that really grew up. And he was someone who grew up in this town. And where I started with him is his journey began as I'm the sheriff of this town of complete strangers. My family's moved away. I don't know, I'm a lawman. What am I even doing here? A lot of times I have to break up fights by threatening people with my six-shooter, and what I came to realize with Ramon was that he took the whole notion of he was a peace officer seriously. So, essentially what happens at the beginning of Owl Dance is he goes off and he starts essentially a quest for how here I am in the 1800s, how do I how do I live the life of helping people to find peace? But even before that, he's not, how does he, even before that, he goes through how do I make a living if I'm not comfortable being a sheriff? What am I good at? What am I going to do? And I think he ends up kind of going through this life journey, and he does finally make the realization through his girlfriend who he's traveling with, who's a healer from Persia, that yeah, it's all about finding a way to make peace in the world, and that ends up becoming the journey that he's going to go on. And we're going to take that in the Brazen Shark to now, he's made this realization. He's made the realization that he can make peace between arguing or warring parties, not necessarily with the use of guns, but by getting people to see each other's perspectives. And now we're going to be tested with that, with people who don't really want to talk to him. And so Ramon's going to have to find the way to get through to those people who don't necessarily want to work with them, who have the agenda of in this case, what actually happens. And I don't think this is too much of a spoiler even for people who have read Lightning Wolves. Basically, what has happened in the 1870s is this is the period of the Meiji Restoration. This is the period where the emperor basically took control and formed his military and eschewing the samurai warriors. So as the Brazen Shark opens, we have a group of samurai warriors who want to regain their place as the military, as the controlling warriors of Japan. And so they are basically fomenting the conflict that already exists between Russia and Japan. And here comes Ramon thrust into the middle of this. And what's he going to do to deal with this person who really their whole motivation is to create this conflict? And he doesn't want to go in there guns blazing against this, these pirates, essentially, these samurai pirates. How cool is that idea? and and take them down, because actually, these are people who are, he has come to realize these are people that, essentially they got thrown out of a job. They got thrown out of the military, as it was for them. And all they're really trying to do is find a way to make a living again. So he's going to be going through the challenge of trying to understand them and resolve this conflict. And whether he does, what we're going to have to find out through the novel, and what I'm going to have to find out with him is, can he do this without causing pain? And if he does cause pain, how is he going to resolve that with his new picture of himself as being a peacekeeper?
All right, so we got two more questions to go, and then we're all set. Um, how do you define success? What kind of milestones do you set for yourself? And how do you know that you've accomplished them? How do you say, you know what? I am a writer. I am an author. No one can take that away from me. I've earned that right.
Gosh, that's a I think that's a bar that's always moving, and that's maybe the hardest part about answering that question. Um, I would say at one point, getting a professional publishing contract was my first bar of success, and I have been there and done that. At one point, I would say maybe. The hard part about it is that I actually went through a period of time where pretty much I made my entire living as a writer and as an editor. So, one of the bars could be I make my living as a writer and an editor. And I did do that for a few years, and I think it was a great period of my life. I went back to doing astronomy basically because I was asked to come back to the observatory, and I think it's a great career. So I kind of do that by choice, not out of financial need. So where is my bar now, I guess, is where I'm getting to for what would I consider. I guess I do consider that I have achieved some success because I have books published. I'm at a point where I get contracts for my books even before I've written them. So I consider that I've been successful in that sense. I guess maybe my next bar, and maybe this is where the dreamer and the imaginer comes in. I just recently, my daughter just started college in New Orleans, and I've just been, just last weekend was over and seeing the mansions in the Garden District of New Orleans. So maybe my next bar of success is I make enough money off of my writing to be able to afford one of those mansions. That's I'm not there yet, but that's certainly something that would be there. Certainly I've got a lot of dreams. I've got dreams about I'd love to see someone be excited enough about one of my books to make it into a movie. So far I've had a couple of people ask to see my books and to see stories that I've written. So far, nothing's been optioned, but that's maybe another thing that I would consider a measure of success. That would be sort of the next level in my career path. So who knows which direction that will be, but I think it's always important to kind of, as no matter what you're doing in life, this really even goes beyond writing. I think if I'm in astronomy, I might think about what's the next thing I'm going to do. I'm always thinking about, what'll I learn next? Will I learn instruments next? As a writer, another thing I'd like to do, and this is maybe down the road, depending on how the dual career balances itself out. If I find myself with a little more time, or I find myself not, rushing to get a book contract in by a deadline, one of the things that's fascinated me for a long time is comic books. Maybe one of the things I might do to challenge myself is to write a comic book script. Maybe I might, actually try turning one of my stories into a screenplay and try to sell it directly that way. So I think it's just an important thing to kind of always set these bars for ourselves. And I think the short answer to your question is I think I have been successful by some measures of success, but I think I could certainly continue to be more successful. And I think no matter where you're at in life, I think you should always try to strive for what's that next step.
All right. And the last question I have for the evening, actually afternoon, but whatever, is how do you write female characters? You being a male, you have to get inside of a mind that is alien to you. So how do you get into the head of female characters and write them effectively? Do you feel you write them effectively? Have people told you that you do a good job with them? What's that process for you?
Well, I have been told that women have told me they've really appreciated the female characters that I write. Um, I think my sort of half joking and maybe more than half serious answer to that is, women are people too. I think it's just a matter of writing people. Uh, when I think of my women characters, it's more that I'm thinking, that character, just happens to be a woman, or they're a woman by the circumstance of what they're doing. Um, a more serious answer to that partly I think comes from the fact that when I was growing up, like I've talked about my dad who was with the railroad, but he worked nights at the railroad. As it turns out, a lot of my time growing up actually I spent with my mom. My dad died when I was 13 years old, so when I basically spent my entire high school experience was pretty much me and my mom. So I kind of got to know how my mom thought about things. I got to hear the stories I heard from family members. I knew my grandmother died quite young. My mom was only 3 years old when she lost her mom, but I knew my great aunts. One of my great aunts lived to be about 109 years old. She passed away actually on September 9th, 2001. So when September 11th came along, I was already feeling pretty blue about this person who was effectively the closest thing I had to a living grandmother at the time. But I was pretty close to my Aunt Ethel, to her daughter, and hearing the stories of their homesteading New Mexico, and what it was like in their early days. So a lot of the stories I heard, the experiential stories I grew up with, were from women's perspectives, and I think that has helped me to really just kind of see, to be able to see things through a woman's eyes without really stretching, really to be able to see beyond the plumbing, so to speak, and to see beyond the hormones, to actually uh, see the world through women as people. And I think really a lot of it is, and even now I've grown up, since I've left home, I married, and then I had two daughters, and so I still live in a household full of women. So it's I still tend to see the world as my daughters experience it, and as my wife experiences it and tells stories, and her friends. So I think that just is just through that circumstance. I have gotten to be able to write women characters effectively, and I think I think again that brings up a good point for all writers, and that is just pay attention to the stories people tell you, pay attention to the perspectives that people have, and listen to them. Sometimes you can't help but listen to a story judgmentally, but when you can, listen to it non-judgmentally and try to see it from that person's perspective. And sometimes if it's like my wife and one of her friends talking to each other, I can kind of sit back and eavesdrop and nod my head and listen to them tell their stories to each other, and just kind of hear what they're saying to each other, and try to understand their perspectives at it. And I think that becomes just a way of seeing the world through those people's eyes, and then using that experience when I'm in turn telling a story over the shoulder of a female character.
Okay, and that comes to about the end of our interview. Is there anything else you want to chat about real quick that you were hoping we'd talk about today, or anything that's come to mind?
Well, I think the main thing is just to say thank you. It's been a lot of fun talking about all these different aspects of writing with you. I'll just, for timeliness, of course, this will go up on YouTube, where someone might discover this 3 years from now. But in a month from now, or in just a week from now, I'm going to be down at the Las Cruces Comic Con. That's my next event. That's the first Comic Con that's happening here in Las Cruces. So anyone local, I encourage you to come by, see what it's all about, learn about the Comic Con experience. A month from now, I'm doing a signing at Coa's bookstore here in Las Cruces. And then in November, or actually it's Halloween weekend of 2014, it's early this year, is Tucson, which is the little literary science fiction convention down in Tucson, Arizona. And I always have a great time at that. So those are some upcoming events I'm at. And I think uh, I will, with that, I'll turn it over to you, and I'm looking forward to seeing your vampire book when it gets done, and I hope people will come out and support it, and support the Kickstarter.
Yeah, I agree with you. It'll probably be 3 years before this becomes popular. Like, oh, these videos are great. It's all like all these authors, and it's like, where were you 3 years ago when I was doing it? Encouragement to do it. I'm kidding, people. I'm kidding. Not really, but I'm kidding. All right, so great interview. I had a lot of fun, David. Really getting to know you over email, and especially now through chat here. Hopefully, in a near future, we can do it again.
I hope so. That'd be great.
So, just a quick shout out about some announcements. If you managed to watch this before October 20th, I do have my Kickstarter going on. This is just to help me out because I'm a disabled person. I can't really work a job, even though I really, really want to, because it would be so much easier than not to work a job. But I am trying to raise money so I can release the first 5 books professionally. and that way I can start making a living as a writer myself. It's still a lot of work to be done. The money is only going to really get my foot in the door, but I'm hoping that it'll be successful enough of a story that I can start generating my own money for my own books and also start the path of recovery, which is one thing I haven't been able to do for my entire ordeal. But definitely go check it out. You're going to see ads for it all over my website, so definitely click on it, check it out, and if you can donate, please do, because I'm like a long ways away from my goal. And just remember, just because you don't have to wait till now to have the money, you won't be charged until it's over with on like the last part of October. So if you think you'll have the money by then, you can go ahead and donate now so you don't forget about it, or you can wait when you are sure that you will have the money. There are plenty of prizes going on, um, and I do have some stretch goals there, and I will have an announcement on the new stretch goal this coming Friday, so pay attention to that. I put updates on the Kickstarter page as well as my blog itself, and always follow my Twitter because I'm always posting things on there. But this will go live on Monday, so tomorrow. Um, so I guess that about does it for me. I once again thank you, David, for a great interview. I think people will really get a lot from this interview. I always love talking to authors who have a lot to say because the authors in the past that I've talked to, and not just on here, but in other places where I really try to pick their mind, they don't always have something to say. And I'm like, how can you not be more proud of your work? Be at least a little bit arrogant.
Well, thank you, Chris, for having me. It's been fun, and I thought you had some great questions, and I really enjoyed myself this afternoon.
All right, so you can check this on my blog and also on YouTube. I'm going to go ahead and sign off here. Um, if you do have any questions, go ahead and check out David's website. Go ahead and check out his Twitter, Adam, and if you can, buy his books, buy every single one of his books. He's already successful, but he could be more successful. Let's get him into a mansion.
And let's pay for my daughter's college education. If we can survive that, that'll be another measure of success.
So hashtag college tuition and get me in a mansion. All right, so I'll see you all next time, and everyone have a good day.